Good job. Testing.
Which you'll hear about today in the presentations. And this is a representation of how connected, a little bit like the brain, we are connected with, we have a network that really connects us with many people in different places in the world to enable us to pursue this research. I want to encourage those of you who are not part of our center to check out the URL I have at the bottom of the page. This is our Pire website, and on the Pire website you'll find blogs that the students here have written over the course of the summer during their experiences, and we invite you to share that with us in learning more about what we've been doing. So today we're going to hear from 9 students who are going to present the preliminary results of their work. I'll say for everyone right off the bat, everyone's work is still in progress. This is a program that's intended to stimulate research by going abroad for 8 weeks, but it's not simply 8 weeks of research. It's also research that then continues when students return to Penn State. We're going to proceed in the order that we have here, which is alphabetical, with one exception, which is that Sarah Carter is going to start off, and then Emily is going to be second, so that these 2 projects are related to one another, so you can have some conceptual integrity in listening to the talks. So I'd like to introduce Sarah and have you begin. We're going to have to figure out how to be conjoined twins for the microphone. Okay. And what we're going to do is I'm going to tell you when 7 minutes are up, and we won't stop you mid-sentence, but then we're going to suggest that you stick to about 7 minutes each, and then we'll have 2 minutes for
Okay, so my name is Emily Sabo. I'm Sarah Carter. Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about resolving sentence ambiguity in relation to verb bias and plausibility. So Sarah and I were part of the monster cohort that traveled to Granada, Spain this summer. It was wonderful. But we have the same materials, the same procedures, as well as a theoretical background, so we're going to tag team this a little bit. Okay, to start off, the main idea that we need to start off with is our past literature indicates that L2 speakers process sentences differently than L1 speakers. Well, in what way does this happen? It's in the way that they predict what's going to follow in a sentence. So, to be clear, all readers make predictions as to what's going to follow based on what they've already previously read. Why do we do this? Because it facilitates our processing. So, if you make a prediction and later it's validated, then your reading time is overall faster. So, to give you an example of this, we're going to read the sentence, the musician sat on the bench and began to play the, and then you have to fill in the blank. So what would you fill and what would you predict? Don't be shy. It's 9 o'clock in the morning. Okay. So I heard banjo, I heard piano. What it actually is piano. Congratulations to some of you. So what happened in this sentence is, as you're reading through the words that are highlighted in red, you saw these certain materials, such as musician, bench, and play. And these helped you predict that what would follow in the blank is the word piano. Okay, so if you predicted piano and your prediction was validated, therefore your reading time was faster. So this is why you make predictions, and that's all that we're talking about here. So now we have 2 types of information that are used to form your predictions. The first is a little more superficial, it's a lot easier to understand. So this would be the semantics. This means, what does the word mean? Does it make sense in this context? Syntactic is a little more intricate. It refers to how words function, how they relate to one another. So it's more usage-based, it takes a more fine-tuned ear, and you have to be more familiar with the language to understand it. So again, these are just 2 ways that you can, 2 tools, sources of information rather, that you can use to resolve syntactic ambiguity. Now, what does syntactic ambiguity mean? I'm sure most of you know. But all it means is that, for example, in this sentence, the doctor believed the man, and the doctor believed the man was crazy. The noun phrase the man has two completely different functions. So in the first one, it's the direct object of believed. So the doctor believed who? The man. Whereas in the second one, it's the doctor believed the man was crazy. So the man is now functioning as the subject of the subordinate clause, and it's being grouped together that way. So when I talk about predictive processing with sentence ambiguity, all you need to keep in mind is that readers are deciding, is the noun phrase that follows the verb, such as the man here, going to function as a direct object, or is it going to get grouped together as that subject of the subordinate clause? So that's all we're referring to. So now to give you some repetition, we look back to this slide. We have these two types of information that are used to form our predictions to resolve this syntactic ambiguity. So if you use the semantic information, right, which is the word's meaning, it would look something like this. So the explorer discovered the treasure. The explorer discovered the warning. So these are the noun phrases following the verb. And in the first one, we see, all we ask ourselves is, does this make semantic sense? So can you discover the treasure? Well, of course you can. So that's a plausible noun phrase to be functioning as a direct object. Whereas in the second phrase, can you discover a warning? Not really, so that's not plausible as a direct object. So when we talk about semantic information, when we're making predictions, that's all we need. This semantic information in the literature is referred to as plausibility, so that's how we'll refer to it from here on out. Now to go back to this tree again. So now if we've talked about semantics, now the whole syntactic information, what does that look like? It's a little more involved, and like I said, it's more intricate, and it requires more a greater familiarity with the language to understand. So whereas before we were looking at the noun phrase following the verb, now we're looking at just the verb. So what's important to understand here is that verbs have a preference to be followed in a certain way. So, for example, the verb discovered prefers to be followed by a direct object, such as the explorer discovered the treasure, discovered the, include whatever you like. So it doesn't matter if the word or the noun phrase following the verb is actually plausible as a direct object or not, but it prefers to take that. And just keep in mind that this is a usage-based thing. So what does that mean? How do we know that these verbs have this bias to take something after it? Well, if you look at corporate linguistics, the number of times that the verb discovered is followed by a direct object is greater than the number of times that discovered is followed by a sentence complement. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay, so this syntactic information is referred to in the literature as verb bias. So from here on out, we'll refer to it as verb bias. And now as Sarah's talking, I want you to think about this lingering question. And this will lead into my research question, essentially. So how do L2 speakers resolve syntactic ambiguity? When they see that noun phrase, how do they know how it's going to function in the sentence? Do they use as plausibility, this semantic information? Or do they use this more in-depth, usage-based information called verb bias? So just keep that in your mind. And then she's going to explain our materials and our procedures, which we both shared. The only thing that changed was our participant groups.
Okay, so given that we know that these two types of information can be drawn upon to facilitate reading, what we wanted to specifically examine was how each of these factors into how two different groups of English speakers process sentences. So how did we test this? So each participant was given a series of syntactically ambiguous sentences to read, or sentences in which the noun phrase that followed the verb could function either as the direct object of that verb or as the subject of the following clause, as Emily mentioned. So we manipulated these two variables in each of our sentences. So to test plausibility, we included sentences that had both a direct object that was plausible.
Oh my goodness, I'm sorry, I don't have any experience with this guy.
It's powerful. So we included sentences that had both a plausible direct object as well as an implausible direct object. So to understand the difference between this, you can see that treasure makes sense as a direct object of discovery. You kind of discover the treasure. However, you cannot understand the treasure. So that's an implausible direct object. And then to test for bias, we included sentences that contained direct object biased verbs, as well as sentences that contained sentential complement biased verbs. So in this case, discovered is a direct object biased verb, which means it's more frequently accompanied by a direct object, where claimed is a sentential complement verb, biased verb, which means that it's most frequently accompanied by a sentential complement. All right, and these two variables were combined to make 4 different conditions that we examined within our experiment. So our first condition contained a direct object biased verb with an implausible or with a plausible direct object. Our second condition contained a direct object biased verb with an implausible direct object. Our third condition contained a sentence complement biased verb with a plausible direct object. And our fourth condition contained a sentence complement biased verb with an implausible direct object. So, all right, so these sentences were contained in a self-paced reading tablet in which the reader guided their way through the sentence at their own pace by prompting each successive word to appear individually by hitting the space button. So this is kind of an example of what the task looked like to the reader as they were on the computer screen, with each different bullet point representing a different part of the sentence that they were processing. So because they were being read individually, that enabled us to measure the reading times of each word and assess which part of the sentence processing difficulty occurred. Okay, so our materials, each participant read 80 experimental sentences that were distributed across those 4 conditions that I mentioned. And each sentence was then immediately followed by a yes or no comprehension question to ensure that they were actually processing the sentence rather than just mechanically scanning their eyes over and hitting the space button. And then we had 80 filler sentences that were interleaved between our experimental sentences to predict or to prevent the reader from miming, which would bias the results. And we also conducted a series of behavioral tasks to measure their proficiency in both Spanish and English. All right, so how would this show up in terms of like the results that we would see? Like, what were our predictions for how plausibility and how verb bias would operate in these sentences? So in terms of a plausible direct object, we would expect that the treasure, which is word 6, which is the actual the beginning of the noun phrase, when it's plausible as a direct object, we would expect minimal difficulty, if any. So a faster reading time. And then for an implausible direct object, which again is word 6 here, we would expect a little bit of processing difficulty to occur because it doesn't make sense as the direct object of that verb. So so that would have a slower reading time. And then for verb bias, words 7 and 8 were the part of the sentence in which it's determined whether there is a direct object or a sentence complement. So for the direct object bias verbs, we would expect there to be a little bit of processing difficulty in those 2 words, so slower reading times for words 7 and 8, because they're predictions that the verb that would, or their predictions that the noun phrase would be a direct object was refuted. And then for the sentence complement bias verbs, we would expect there to be a relatively faster reading time for words 7 and 8 because this confirmed their predictions that would be followed. All right, so my specific research question looked to examine whether immersion in the L2 environment influences how English speakers process sentences. So I was looking at why, if native English speakers who are living abroad in Spain lost some of the verb bias information that's been shown to shape their processing. As past research shows that when individuals have been living in their second language environment for a long enough time, this can begin to influence their use of their first language. So my participant group was 28 English Spanish bilinguals who had been living in Granada, Spain for at least 1 year. And my expected outcomes was that these English-Spanish speakers would exhibit processing tendencies that were similar to English monolinguals, so that their immersion in the L2 environment wouldn't necessarily factor significantly into how they processed. So in which case, the verb bias would be more influential in processing their sentences than plausibility. So my results show that at word 6, which is, so it's clear plausibility is not influencing the rate at which they're processing this part of the sentence. However, at words 7, which is where you see, for example, in the French explorers discovered the treasure could cost them their lives. That's where they see that there's going to be a sentence complement in that second part. However, because it's direct object bias, they're expecting a direct object to ensue. You can see that the reading times here are significantly slower than the reading times for the sentence complement verbs, because in the second case, in both of the sentence complement biased verbs, their prediction was confirmed when they encountered the sentence complement. So there you go.
Okay, so now we're returning back to the same slide that I left you with. So my question was, how do L2 speakers resolve syntactic ambiguity? So our options, just like in Sarah's experiment, were plausibility, the semantic information, or the verb bias, the syntactic. Okay, so what were my expectations? I'll explain those first. So I was expecting that I'll give you my participant group, that might be good. Okay, so I actually ran 35 Spanish-English bilinguals. However, due to their proficiency, the results in the proficiency tasks, we cut off at 70% and below, so that leaves me with 28. So my participants were native Spanish speakers who are bilingual in English, but they're living in Granada, Spain, so they're not living in their L2 environment, and they're not getting exposure with their L2. Okay, so keep that in mind, that this is their non-immersion environment. So my question is, again, will these bilinguals who are not in an immersion environment resolve their syntactic ambiguity with plausibility or verb bias? So unlike Sarah's predictions, mine were the opposite, because I'm expecting that they can access this plausibility information because it's a little easier to understand, whereas this verb bias information it's usage-based, so it requires more exposure to the language, which they don't have because they're not in that environment. So what I was expecting to see was sensitivity to plausibility, but not verb bias. However, what we found was very encouraging because it showed that my participants actually were sensitive to both, which makes them a little bit more native-like in their characteristics than what I had expected. So what does this look like? So again, we're looking at here, the height is their reading time, so a higher graph will mean that their reading times were longer, so they had more processing difficulty. And then the four different graphs, the 4 different bars, refer to our 4 conditions. So this is giving you a little sample of our plausibility effect. So this is something that we expected to see. Now when we look at it, we see that the implausible direct objects take more time to read than plausible. So therefore we're seeing that my participants are in fact susceptible and sensitive to plausibility.
I think you guys want to finish up in about 1 minute.
Sure, that's fine. And then at word 7, we were expecting to see a little bit of a reaction, but there was nothing. What we assume is that there's some spillover. So as our participants are clicking through, we're starting to see their actual reaction at word 8. So here what we see is an interaction effect, which means that verb bias and plausibility were working together, unlike what I had expected. So it's easier for my participants to process a sentence complement when the noun phrase is implausible. So if you have any questions, since we're out of time, you can of course ask us what we learned in Granada. It's a beautiful place. We want to thank the NSF Pire grant, Julie Ducius, and did you want to?
Yeah,
Sure.
So we wanted to thank Julie Ducius for giving us some of her very, very, very scant amount of time, as well as Dr. Fidegalapo for sharing her limited lab space with us during our time there, as well as welcoming us into her lab group. And Amelia Dietrich, as well as Alvaro Villegas, who is not here with us today. He's alive. Yeah, he's in a different time zone. For all of their help along every step of the way to Granada.
And those are some pictures. So if you have any questions,
Well, I think that what we're going to do right now is we're going to pass on questions, just because even though it would be wonderful to have time for questions, I think we need to stay.
Sure.
Thank
you
you.
can email us or talk to us after.
The next speaker is Sarah Fairchild.
Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Fairchild, and as part of the Pire program I went to Bangor University in Wales, where I visited Dr. Margaret Duger. Today I'm going to present the findings of the study I conducted there, which was on determiner noun code switching in Welsh-English bilinguals. So code switching is when a bilingual switches between his or her two languages within a single utterance. And what we're looking at specifically are these code switch nominal phrases like the one seen here, where one language is used for the determiner and another language is used for the noun. Our study compares two theories that attempt to explain these types of code switch phrases. The first is the minimalist theory, which says that the determiner should come from the gendered language, which in this case is Welsh. The second is the matrix language frame theory, which says that the determiner should come from the matrix language, which is defined as the language containing the finite verb. So in 2010, Pire and colleagues looked at Welsh English and Spanish English corpora to investigate this question. What they found was that the minimalist program could always make a correct prediction, but that the matrix language frame theory was not far behind, with almost 99% accuracy in the Welsh English corpus. So what we did was translated these theories into an experiment to look at the psychological component and the online processing of these code switched phrases. So in Bangor, we collected data from a true community sample of participants. We had 17 Welsh English bilinguals who ranged in age from 20 to 78, which I know there's a lot of variability there, but I will say that almost all of them were retired people in the community. And they rated their Welsh speaking proficiency quite highly, a 9.4 out of 10, as opposed to the 8.1 in English. And Welsh was their first language. So we gave them a series of picture naming tasks which elicited these determiner noun code switches, in addition to a battery of individual differences measures. The first task we gave them was just bare picture naming to get an idea of their proficiency. So they saw a picture on the screen and had to name it in one of their two languages. Next came the two critical code switching tasks. In task 2, they saw the same pictures, but this time were asked to name them using both a determiner and a noun. There were a total of 4 conditions with all possible language combinations. So an English determiner and an English noun, the horse, a Welsh determiner and a Welsh noun, y ceffyl, an English determiner and a Welsh noun, the ceffyl, and finally a Welsh determiner and an English noun, a horse. In task 3, they saw a sentence on the screen that could either be in English or in Welsh. They were then presented with a picture, which they again were asked to name using a determiner and a noun. There were 8 total conditions in this. The 4 language combinations we saw in task 2, each paired with an English sentence and a Welsh sentence. We added the sentence in order to create a matrix language. So what we found from the bare picture naming is that these people were more proficient in English than they were in Welsh. They had a higher accuracy in English. The reaction times were not different, but we still think that it suggests that they were more proficient in English. So in task 2, the minimalist theory would predict that the conditions in which they had to produce a Welsh determiner would be quicker. We didn't find a difference in the reaction times among the conditions, but if you look at the 2 code switch conditions, which are circled here, you can see that they actually took longer to produce the Welsh determiner, which would suggest that here the minimalist theory is not supported. So the results from task 3 are very complex, but I'll walk you through the most important parts. If I can draw your attention to the 2 pairs of conditions with the arrows, the ones on the left are the code switch conditions with English as a matrix language, and the ones on the right are the code switch conditions with Welsh as a matrix language. The differences were not significant, but if you look at the trend when English is a matrix language, you can see that they actually produce the Welsh determiner more quickly, which would be more in line with the minimalist theory. And if you look on the right, where Welsh is the matrix language, the Welsh determiner was also produced more quickly this time, which would be predicted by both the matrix language frame theory and the minimalist theory. And across the board, you can see that their accuracy goes way down every time they have to produce a Welsh noun on the right-hand graph. So as you can see, we found mixed support for both of the theories, and this may be due to the fact that they had a lower proficiency in Welsh. And again, these are just preliminary results, so the next step in our analysis is to look at proficiency and other individual differences like age and cognitive control to see what's actually going on here. And right now, we're currently collecting data from Spanish-English heritage speakers here at Penn State. So with that, I'd like to thank Jeanette and everyone else who helped me on this project, and you for listening. Are there any questions?
So these people grade their self-ratings, they think their Welsh is more proficient, but apparently that's not the case.
Right. So what I heard from them a lot is that they spoke Welsh a lot with their friends and family, but they used a lot of English words when they were speaking. So that may contribute to the fact that they were much less accurate in the Welsh nouns, but
more than they realize.
right.
Hello everyone, my name is Emma Hans. I'm an undergrad research assistant in Dr. Jeanette Van Hel's lab. In this past summer, I was fortunate enough to receive the Pire Fellowship, which allowed me to conduct research abroad at Lund University in Sweden, alongside with Dr. Marianne Goldberg. And the question that we were kind of investigating is whether or not the scripts of a bilingual's languages has an effect on their ability to then learn a third language. In terms of novel word learning, there's kind of a widely accepted bilingual advantage, saying that bilinguals, compared to their monolingual counterparts, process and learn novel words both faster and better. The question that I kind of brought to Dr. Van Hel last year was whether or not the scripts would make a difference. Just kind of from personal experience, it would seem that a different script language would sort of impede that. In 2009, Koshinskaya and Marianne did a study where they basically concluded that there is actually no difference. The issue here, though, is that both of the groups that they were testing were English, or they had English as their L1. But in the early stages of novel word learning, you make the lexical attachments, or lexical processing attaches these novel words to your L1. So in both of these conditions, with the same script, they had an L1 of English, different as well, so you actually don't see the script effect here. So what we realized is that to really determine whether or not there is a script effect, the difference has to be in the L1. So what we decided to do is test the same script bilinguals having Swedish L1, English L2, and then back at school, in State College, to test the different script bilinguals, which would be Mandarin L1, English L2. The novel word that they're learning, or the novel language that they're learning words in, rather, is Malay, which, like Swedish and English, is an alphabetic language, so our general predictions were that in conforming with the bilingual advantage, both the different script and same script bilinguals would outperform the monolinguals, but that there would actually be a difference between the two bilingual groups. The idea was that having two alphabetic languages, the same script bilinguals would actually outperform the different script bilinguals. Now, keep in mind, just for this, we're still working on the Mandarin English, so what I'll be presenting is the information from the Swedish English bilinguals, or the same script bilinguals. So the methods that we used are in line with those used by Koshinskaya and Marianne. It was a learning study, or a learning task, as well as recall and recognition, and a delayed recall and recognition. In the learning task, participants learned a total of 24 words, and how they were initially presented with what was kind of considered the learning screen, where you had the word in Malay, pakaian, and the Swedish translation, lera, shown on the screen, while simultaneously, the participant was simultaneously presented with the Malay word auditorially. So what would happen is you'd see the two words, you'd hear pakaian, and then it would progress through, so the participants with voice onset and voice cues would be asked to then produce pakaian, lera, pakaian, lera. Tests were recall and recognition, as I said previously. So for the recall, the participants would see the Malay word on the screen and hear it pronounced, and then it would progress to a fixation point rather, and they would be asked to produce the Swedish translation, or their native translation, which will come for the later conditions. The recognition was a little bit different in that they did see this same Malay word and heard it auditorially, but instead of progressing to a fixation cross, it progressed to a screen that had 5 different options. The correct translation, as well as 4 different foils. The foils were words that were lexically similar, semantically related, an endless distractor, as well as a completely random word also. All of these words were presented in their L1, so in Swedish. The results that we had, just in terms of recall, accuracy was much lower than we had expected. No significant results between the immediate and delayed tests. There was a 1-week lag between the 2 tests. But with the reaction time, once again, no significant results. That's because the reaction time that we were actually able to process was much, much lower in terms of numbers, because so few participants responded to quite a few of the prompts. For the recognition, once again, no significant results between immediate delayed for either accuracy or reaction time. But what we do see, as you would expect, is that participants perform much, much, much better on the recognition task than they do on the recall. One of the interesting things, though, that we decided to do is to try and figure out what kind of errors these participants are making with the recognition task. So these analyses along the bottom in this graph, the blue would be the lexical distractor, yellow is the semantic distractor, the green is the endless distractor that they have already seen, and the red is the completely random. As you can see in both the immediate and delayed, participants were significantly more likely to select the endless distractor than they were to select any of the others. It's kind of along the lines of what you would expect, because they have seen these words before. But probably the most interesting is the trend that the semantic distractor plays, in that the participants are significantly more likely to select the semantic distractor in the delayed test than they are in the immediate test, which would kind of give you the idea that while the participants may not be preserving the exact form of the translation, they are encoding the underlying meaning, which is kind of an interesting trend. And then currently we are testing these Mandarin English or the different script bilinguals, and then we'll progress to testing the English monolinguals, tact as the control, and results should be done early in January. So, thank you. Are there any questions?
So, do you have a sense of your Swedish participants, if they knew third or fourth languages, or if English was really the only other language they knew?
Yeah, okay, so that was actually a big, big problem that we had with recruiting. Sweden is unique in that there's such a high level of English fluency, but there is a lot of background in middle school and high school, especially with German. So that really narrowed down the number of people that I could test. I ended up only being able to test 15 that I used, just because of having to eliminate people based on experience abroad or other fluency. Everyone that we tested has less than 1 year of experience in a third language at the college level, because you can't really measure the amount of fluency attained through either middle school or high school.
Thank you. Next speaker is Tom Hall. Apparatus here.
All right, so, sorry. Hi, I'm Thomas Holt. So, some background information about myself. I'm a dual major in, sorry. This good? This good?
Yeah.
All right. And a little bit nervous. So, all right, so some background information about myself. I'm dual majoring in Chinese and international politics, concentration in national security. I'm also minoring in linguistics and history. So I'm currently in my 5th semester here of Chinese here at Penn State, and I previously studied abroad in Shanghai in summer of 2011. So that was one of my motivations for applying to Pire. I really enjoyed my study abroad experience. I wanted to go back to China as soon as possible, so Pire presented one opportunity for that, and also, in addition, allowing me to conduct my own linguistics research. So I conducted my research at Beijing Normal University, and specifically what I studied was the ability of native speakers to distinguish between the lexical tones of Chinese. Chinese is a tonal language. There's 4 distinct tones in it for syllables, and thereby we could create a standard which L2 learners of Chinese could aim for, improving their listening ability. So, some background information about my research. I've studied categorical perception, which is the ability of humans to perceive continuous changes in a single as discrete. And it's relatively automatic and effortless in phoneme production, in speech perception. And there's been numerous studies on the phenomenon for individual phonemes of alphabetic languages. There hasn't been so much on whether the contrast also applies to lexical tones in tonal languages. However, some recent studies seem to have shown that is the case. Like, for instance, in this one study by Shi et al. In 2010, when participants listened to the 11-tone tone continuum going from rising, which tone 3, you can see there is rising, to falling to tone 11, with participants were relatively consistent distinguishing tones 1 through 4 as rising, tones 7 to 11 as falling. So my goals for this summer were to replicate the categorical perception of lexical tones in native Chinese speakers, but I also devised 2 different behavioral tasks we could use so we could determine which is more effective for testing categorical perception. In addition, as I said before, categorical perception is relatively automatic and effortless, so what we also wanted to study was the brain response in participants in hearing the stimuli. And specifically, we use NIRS. NIRS is a method of measuring brain activity by using low-powered lasers to observe the amount of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood in certain regions of the brain. So, talking about my behavioral task, we use the 11 manipulated variations of the BOSS syllable from the previous studies. And we had 2 versions of the task, a long version and a short version. In the long version, there were 10 trials each of the 11 tones, randomly sorted, and the participants were asked to judge whether each tone was rising or falling. In the short behavioral task, the 11 tones were just ordered sequentially and again in reverse order, and the participants made the same judgments as the long task. Oh, sorry. Part of my data notes in.
Just explain it.
Okay, so what we've seen was that in like the past studies, what we saw is that as could be compared to the past studies, the participants were relatively consistent in distinguishing between the lexical tones. For instance, going back to this one slide, basically our results pretty much match the studies of the Shi et al. Study in that the participants were consistent distinguishing tones 1 through 4 as rising and tones 7 and 11 as falling. So, in addition, in regards to the behavioral test, what we found was that the character perception in the behavioral task was very highly correlated with the behavioral task, basically around 0.792, I believe. Was there in my slide, but it's missing. Alright, so that's it, the behavioral. In the nears, we use, again, the same ba syllables from the previous studies. We had a standard tone, which was tone 7, which can be seen there. And within the standard, tone 11 was the within, and that, again, is a falling tone. And then across in the standard, which was tone 3 at 7, tone 3 being a rising tone. So what we hypothesized was that there'd be a greater response in the superior tumble gyrus to the within stream, and a greater response in the middle tumble gyrus to a cross stream. And this is because previous studies such as John et al. Has shown that the superior tumble gyrus is associated with acoustic processing, while the middle tumble gyrus is associated with linguistic processing. And what our responses show that in the right superior tumble gyrus, there's a strong trend for within greater than across. And in the left middle tumble gyrus, there is no significant difference in the expected nearest contrast. This was despite the fact that every participant was successful in the behavioral discrimination task. And one reason this may be is just because nears may not be sensitive enough to detect this difference reliably. Past studies had used ERP, so it just may be that use is an effective tool for this task. So besides the research I did, I was also lucky enough to travel extensively. In Beijing, I saw the Forbidden City and the Temple of Heaven, 2 sites I'd wanted to see all my life. As you can see in my first slide, I also got to hike a section of the Great Wall. Also saw the Summer Palace. Had 2 weeks on my own where I was able to travel to Xi'an, where I saw the Terracotta Warriors, biked the ancient city wall, climbed Mount Huashan, one of the 5 holiest mountains in China. After that, I went to Chengdu, where I didn't do so much tourism. Instead, just met people, tried the local food, basically just relaxed before I headed off to Beijing to do my research. And I was also lucky enough to go back to Shanghai twice to see old friends from my previous abroad experience. And these are just some pics of Xi'an. So, besides the research I did at Beijing, I'd say one of the other best benefits of Pire was just how much it allowed me to improve my Chinese. I mean, I'd say I spoke Chinese 90% of the time while I was there, barely any English. When I first got off the plane, I could barely hold a conversation, barely understand what the cab driver was saying. 1 week later, I was having full-length conversations. And honestly, I wouldn't be taking like Chinese for free right now if I hadn't done Pire. Basically, I'm really grateful for how Pire allowed me to improve my Chinese. So, in addition, I think that because of the fact that I spoke Chinese, I was able to make friends with the native Chinese a lot more easily. So I made a lot of new friends, but I also got to get back in touch with friends I met from when I was in Shanghai. Since coming back to the U.S., I've kept in touch with them extensively, and it just makes me want to go back to China more. So I'd just like to thank the Pire Committee for giving me this opportunity. I'd like to thank Ping Li and the PSU Brain Language Computation Lab for all their help they did and just being great people to work with. I'd like to thank Benjamin Zisner for his extensive help in helping me along the way with my Pire project. Don't think I would be here without him. And I also like to thank all the faculty and students at Beijing Normal University for being so welcoming and helping us conduct our research. So, any questions?
Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Melissa. I work in Dr. Karen Miller's lab, and we've been studying the explanation in the speech of Spanish-speaking children. I got the opportunity to go to Granada, Spain this summer as well, and it was a great experience. These are some pictures. That's the famous Alhambra, and that's just a view from the top of the building, actually. I spent most of my time working in an elementary school in Granada since we were studying the explanation in Spanish-speaking children, and that's me in front of the school. Now, what is explanation? Essentially, explanation is a phonological process where the syllable final S of the word is affected. So I'm going to give you more examples in just a second. But in previous research, it's been described as fully articulated, so the S is pronounced. It could be aspirated, where instead of an S, it's more of an H sound, like a, or deleted or omitted, where there's no sound at all, so there's no H or no S. And for an example, in the word gatos, meaning cats, an example of production would be pronounced as gatos. An example of aspiration in the word mismo, meaning the same, it would sound like mismo. And lastly, omission, where there's no sound in the word jugemos, would be pronounced as jugemo. And last summer in Karen Miller's lab, we presented, two other undergraduate students and I presented our research that was already collected in Chile by Professor Miller. And a lot of times in the past, adult-to-adult speech was been observed, but what we did is we observed child-directed speech. So this is a mother speaking to a child, and we focused primarily on the speech style, the phonological environment, the sex of the speaker, the child, whether the S was morphological or not, whether the S was in the middle of the word or the end, and like I said, child and adult-directed speech. Now, what we decided to do is to take this same research and bring it to Granada. In the picture, that's Analia. She was the research assistant that helped me run our tests on the children. She was a native Spanish speaker, which helped a lot because I wasn't. So that was really helpful. And in order to, compare what we've learned in the past year, looking at the research, the data from Chile, we wanted to know whether or not Spanish-speaking children from Granada, Spain, pattern with adults in their usage of explanation, and how the Andalusian Spanish compares with Chilean Spanish in regards to explanation. So in order to find these answers, what we did was we collected data from 12 children, 12 adults. Well, we really had more children, but we're still in the process of going through all the recordings and analyzing them. But for right now, we currently have 12 children, ages 3 to 6, and 12 adults, mostly from the University of Granada. And what we did was we had 5 different tasks, and each of these tasks elicited a different speech style. So we had a picture naming task, which was more of a formal speech. We had Verko's WUG task, which I think some of you are familiar with. That was also formal. A movie short that was more casual. We played a card game with the kids, and we also just had spontaneous speech, which was, what do you eat for breakfast? What do you do in the morning? And just to go into some detail about the picture naming task, what we would do is Analia would say, aquí hay un cuarto nuevo, here is a new boat. And then she would ask the kid, based upon how well my drawings were, no artist, but she would say, and here, what's here? And the kid would have to respond, here is an old boat, aquí hay un barco vieja. And then in order to compare singular versus the plural form, she would then ask, and here, and the kid would have to say, aquí hay 6 barcos viejas, some old boats, anything just to, for the plural, anything to elicit the plural. This is just an example of Verko's WUG task where we would have made up Spanish words. Analia would start by saying, here is a dopa, which is just a made up word. And now there are two dopas the kids would have to say. We would have to hear whether or not they pronounced the S. We also showed a movie, and this was just for to collect some casual speech, to see, more conversational, and ask the kids to explain the movie. Now what we're doing now is we're using Pratt analysis to analyze the gradient-dependent variable. And essentially, instead of just dividing it into, whether we hear an S, an H, or a 0, we're analyzing it more on the gradient scale, because a lot of times, especially in Granada, where aspiration was so common, it's hard to determine exactly whether it's an S, an H, or a 0. So this helps us see where this S production falls on that gradient. And we're doing this by taking the word and dividing it into the S segment and then the vowel plus the S segment to help us see where it's plural and to see where they pronounce the S and where they don't. And we're using this by the frication of the duration of the S, and essentially what that is that's just the duration. So the longer the duration we see, the more indication that there is an S present. The center of gravity, which measures the frequency, and the higher the frequency, the also more indication of an S. And lastly, the percent of voicelessness. Now, voicelessness focuses more on vowels, and the higher voicelessness we see, the more aspiration we see, because you're vocalizing when you use a vowel, and if you have voicelessness, then that's indicating aspiration. Now, what we plan to do for the spring of 2013 is we plan to see how those three factors that I just mentioned there, for example, how the duration would be affected by these extralinguistic independent variables. So we're going to be looking at the sex of the speaker, so whether or not, if you're male or female, how that affects the duration of the S segment of the word. The age of the speaker, whether or not children or adults have a longer or shorter S segment. Speech style, so like I said before, whether that was casual speech or formal speech. The following phonological segment regarding whether or not there's a fricative sound or vowel before, morphological versus monomorphemic, and word medial versus word final. So this is all stuff that we plan to look at for the spring of 2013. And here, this is what we've looked at for the past from Chile. Since we looked at child-directed speech, we looked at a mother speaking to a 3-year-old boy, and what we did was, using 108 tokens from a conversation she had, we divided her speech into 4 different speech styles. You can see casual teaching, a puppet voice where she was, literally pretending to be a puppet, and disciplining, don't do this, don't do that. And we found out that in child-directed speech, mothers tend, at least this mother, tend to pronounce their S more. So whether that's through educating her children or speaking more slowly. And just another interesting thing we found was that there is less S, and there's more omission when the mother is disciplining the child. So she's don't touch that, don't do that. And usually we found it was because she speaks a lot quicker and maybe doesn't have enough time to produce that S. Here's just some more preliminary research regarding parts of speech. We had a determiner, so just the articles, nouns, and verbs. We found out that more overt forms, S and H, are on determiners than are on nouns. We also found, interestingly, that omissions of second singular verbal suffix, so, tu hablas, we found that there was more omission on that than there was on nouns and determiners, so I think I'm running out of time.
Finish up in here.
This is just last piece of information regarding the phonological environment. So whether or not S is followed by a vowel, a stop, or a pause, we found that when followed by a vowel in the word, the S is, there's more omissions than when it's followed by a pause. So whether or not that speaker has more time to, after the stop or pause, whether the speaker has more time to pronounce the S versus the vowel, which are usually shorter in Spanish, how they just sometimes, might not have time to pronounce the S. And just like to say thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. My name is Jessie Martz, and I'm here to talk a little bit about my Pire experience. I, thanks to Pire, had the opportunity to go to Radboud University to work with Dr. Dorothy Chvilla. And this was a really interesting experiment to me because I was experiencing exactly what I was studying. And I'm sure that many of you can relate to this, being in a country abroad where there's a language spoken that you don't personally speak, but you're listening to it and you're reading it, but you're speaking in English still. So this is what I'm studying, the context of this situation, and find out what people are learning. So just to go back to some background information, this is where we start off at. We look at children from this OWL study to find out that children who overhear a language at an early age, later in life as an adult learner, develop better phonology of the overheard language compared to regular adult learners. And also, when looking at other immersion studies, that adult people immersed in a native language are at an advantage over classroom learners. But there's a cost to these people who are immersed in the second language in that their native language, English in this case, becomes inhibited. So we want to look at, these are all studies on incidental learning. We want to look at implicit learning to find out what people are learning with no intention. So going back to some more background information of early learning studies, we find out that people learn things without even knowing that they're learning it. So in this McLaughlin study, we look at classroom learners who behaviorally show that they're not learning anything, but from ERP data, it shows that their brain activity is learning. So, and this is another interesting study by Verhoeven, shows that people who are exposed to very short, like 7-minute clips of Mandarin Chinese reports, showed brain activity related to language learning, which shows that they are learning it at very minimal exposure. And switching a little bit to bilinguals. Bilinguals in these incidental learning situations are advantaged over monolinguals. So we want to look at, again, what people are learning in this implicit learning to find out what's happening when they're not trying to learn the language. So this takes us to our research questions. First of all, like I've been saying the whole time, what are people learning without trying? Are bilinguals advantaged over monolinguals in this situation? And after time, like in the previous study, are they becoming inhibited by their native language? So this gave me a perfect opportunity to go to Radboud University because in the Netherlands, there's many English speakers who have no intent of learning the Dutch language because they're only there for a short time, and because many of the native Dutch speakers, almost all of them, are highly proficient in English also. So we tested native Dutch speakers who also spoke English and native English speakers who were not proficient in German or Dutch. And ideally, I would have liked to have more participants as English speakers, but it was kind of hard in Nijmegen. And I have written here native English speakers with L2 experience because this is based off self-reports from language history questionnaires. And as you can see, the 6.30, that's not a very highly rated proficiency of the second language. So we tested them in a lot of different tasks on their speaking abilities and written abilities and cognitive abilities in the operation span and Simon task. And what we found was, can native English speakers without formal knowledge of Dutch translate from Dutch to English? And this is looking at translation, and there's also from picture naming, which is also a spoken task that we couldn't put on here due to time restraints and slides. People were not picking up very much. I mean, you could see that the bilinguals and monolinguals were fairly the same, and they're not learning a lot. And when we look at the Dutch lexical decision, again, this is a written task to see if people could distinguish, but not enough to be significant. And yes, the second language speakers learned a little bit more in this and had higher accuracies, but it's not very much. And maybe if we had a higher sample size, there would be different, but I'm not sure. But when we look at the English lexical decision, we can see that the Dutch
task or the Dutch people and the English-speaking people, they're fairly similar, which could mean multiple things. One, that maybe the Dutch speakers were just highly proficient and really good at what they were doing, or it could mean that the English speakers who were there were showing signs of inhibition in their native language. So this is something that we can't be sure of until I'm done testing participants here at Penn State. So that's what I'm doing now, and in due time, maybe we'll find out that yes, there was inhibition of the English language, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see. So switching gears a little bit, I just want to talk about my experience in the Netherlands. I had the opportunity to work with Dorothy Trilla, right there, and I had an amazing time. I didn't want to leave by the time I was done, and I ended up staying there for 10 weeks to test a couple more participants because I was having trouble finding English speakers. So all in all, I mean, I learned so much about myself. I went there alone for the first time. This was the first time leaving the United States. So I was really nervous, but once I got there, I found out that it really wasn't that big of a deal because everyone was so kind and helpful. And Jeanette put me in contact with one of her students, Sabrine, who just made me feel so comfortable and welcome. She introduced me to people. I made friends in the lab because of it. And, you know, I learned so much about research in itself. I don't think that I could have learned in a classroom or even as a research assistant, as far as making up an idea, testing participants, recruiting participants, analyzing the data. These are things that I don't think I could have learned elsewhere. So, I mean, thank you to Pire and Judy for spending so much time with me and patience with me. So, again, thank you. Questions?
Jessie, so you tested your participants using the word cognates and non-cognates, right?
Yeah. Hi everyone, is this a good distance? Okay. So my name is Beth and I worked with Carrie Jackson and we were looking at the production of subject-verb agreement in English by L1 speakers of Swedish. And I was with Emma, we were in Lund, which was in southern Sweden, which despite its southern location was still pretty cold while we were there, which we were a little unprepared for, but it was fun. So errors in production and comprehension of subject-verb agreement are influenced by grammatical and notional number features. So what this means is that we have the grammatical information, so if we have a singular head noun like label, we're going to conjugate, or we're going to inflect the verb using is, right, the singular verb. But what happens is when we have this competing information, which is the notional information. So while it's grammatically singular, when you look at the picture, there are actually multiple labels on the bottle. So what that means is that people are more likely, when we have this multiple token, to make a mistake and say the label on the bottle are whatever your adjective is. This is in comparison with a single token condition where you have something like an author. So even though we have the author of the novel, they're still less likely to make a mistake because conceptually there's only one author of, even though there are many novels. So L2 research shows us that there are differences in the degree of sensitivity to notional versus grammatical agreement as a function of L2 proficiency. We were going to study this, but we had a little trouble manipulating proficiency because, but we could use this because Swedish English bilinguals are highly proficient in English, so we saw this. We also see that in L2 comprehension data that they show differences in the degree of sensitivity based on the cross-linguistic morphological similarity. So this means that in languages like Spanish, which have subject-verb agreement, then it's easier for them to compute subject-verb agreement than in Japanese, for Japanese native speakers. We wanted to look at Swedish because it has rich noun morphology, but it does not inflect verbs for number, meaning that it's kind of a unique situation compared to languages that were previously studied. So we wanted to know if Swedish English bilinguals would make attraction or notional agreement errors in L2 English production. We had 22 L1 Swedish learners of English from Lund University in Sweden. There were actually more, but we had to throw out a few for early bilingualism, and then there were two that didn't do very well in filler items, and they also had very low proficiency. So we used a sentence fragment completion task in which they see an adjective and then a preamble, and it looks a little bit like this. So we see the fixation point, an adjective, they see a preamble, and then we ask them to put it together to elicit the verb. And again, we're expecting that they're going to get the most wrong on the label on the bottles because that's the condition where you have the two competing sources of information. So we wanted to see that this would be similar to both L1 speakers of English and L2 speakers of English who have both noun phrase morphology and verbal morphology. So we wanted to look at the filler items to make sure that they weren't using the strategy to just conjugate for whatever the local noun is, and they weren't because they were at ceiling for all of these conditions. And we did see that they did have overall more errors in the multiple token condition and more errors in when there was the plural morpheme marker. So we saw a main effective morphology, so we saw that that S is making them a little bit more confused. And we also saw the main effective notionality showing that there's a significant interaction for plural agreement in the multiple token condition. This parallels native speaker data, showing that the underlying process of agreement is similar, and it's also influenced by grammatical and notional information. And this is true for other L2 populations as well. So the way that it differs, though, is that the overall errors are higher compared to other L2 speakers. So we think this is because they have less, I don't want to say practice, they're less used to computing subject-verb agreement in their L1, so when they're speaking in their L2, their overall error rate is higher. So right now I'm collecting monolingual English data because the data that we're comparing it to, the tasks are slightly different. So I'm collecting monolingual data, and we might do Chinese English bilingual. We'll see. So thank you to everyone, especially Carrie Jackson. She's on sabbatical, so she's not here, but she has spent so much time helping with this, and I want to thank everyone else here as well. So thank you. Does anyone have any questions? No question? Yeah.
Elizabeth, so what do you expect to find with the Chinese English speakers? Do you think it's going to be similar to the speakers you tested here?
Well, one thing is that there are a few things I can influence. One of those things.
I had the privilege this summer to go to Granada, Spain, and work on my project about the comprehension of code switches among speakers who don't code switch. Here is a picture of our lab group, and it's pretty neat because we actually became close with quite a few of them, so that was a good experience. There's some pictures of the trip, and I was actually lucky enough to celebrate my 20th birthday in Spain, so that was really exciting. Enjoyed it. And at the bottom there, Emily and I actually, we got to go behind the counter in our favorite cafe, so that was another great experience. Okay, so I'm going to start with a brief overview of code switching. Code switching is generally defined as the fluid alternation between language and bilingual speech. For example, El Niño está reading the book from the library, and is an example of a code switch. And in many bilingual communities, people code switch, so it's very common linguistic behavior. And it's a sign of membership and identity. And to illustrate this further, I have a video. So, hold on one second.
Bueno, mi mamá es cubana y mi papá es de El Salvador, pero nacimos aquí en the United States of America. Right. So our first language is English. Entonces, cuando nosotros empezamos en el mercado del entretenimiento, on what is TV and radio, all of a sudden, our professor says, you have an accent. Y yo como, ¿qué? What does that mean, I have an accent? What accent do I have? I was born and raised in the United States of America. I'm an American. And they're like, well, you have a Spanish accent. You need to work on that. So then, cuando fuimos al mercado hispano, me dicen, ustedes tienen acento. ¿Qué? ¿Cómo puedo tener acento americano si yo sé el español? Cuando yo hablo el español, yo lo hablo como lo estamos hablando ahora. I can't start acting como, hola, ¿qué tal? Yo me llamo Marisa González. I don't want to be like a robot, like, hola, ¿qué tal? Buenos días. That's not me. I can't be fake. it's frustrating because we're not Spanish enough for the Spanish market, we're not English enough for the English market. So where does that leave us? ¿A dónde estamos? Are we in the Spanglish market? Does that exist? And I know that many Latinos go through that.
What's up with the accent stuff?
Can you like leave us alone with that?
Can we stop to that?
That's us. We speak the way we speak. If you guys don't like it, well then, can we like do something about that? Bueno, mi mamá es cubana y mi papá es de El Salvador, pero
Pretty funny. So as you can see from the video, the production of code switching switchers is presumably under the control of the speaker, as you just saw. And for the comprehender, switches may be unexpected, so listeners and readers may not explicitly know when a switch is going to occur. So comprehending code switch language may be costly. But listeners and readers do not report having trouble processing code switching. And many of us in here who have a little bit of a Spanish background probably could understand pretty well what was going on in that video. So my hypothesis is that certain pairs of words in a sentence form a unit. And these words form units because they co-occur very frequently during speech. So switching is more difficult to process if it occurs between two words that form a unit. Example. A verb like dijo and an accompanying complementizer like que form a unit. So basically they're like peanut butter and jelly. So for instance, you'll hear Juan dijo que la verdad more often than you would hear Juan dijo la verdad, because dijo is more often followed by a sentence that begins with que. So to reiterate my hypothesis, dijo que forms a unit, so switching between these units, between these two elements is going to be costly. Dijo que the boy was here is going to be easier to process than dijo that the boy was here. So in my study, I had 4 conditions, dijo que, dijo that, which are both sentential complements, and which means that they are most frequently followed by, the verb is most frequently followed by que. And then confirmo que and confirmo that, which are, there is equally likely to be followed by que as any other complementizer. For my participants, they're all native speakers of Spanish who are proficient in English and living in Spain. And we chose these participants because it was an extreme way of testing our hypothesis. These speakers do not code switch. If Spanish pairs of words form units, then they should have trouble processing code switches that break Spanish units versus code switches that do not break Spanish units. So all my participants between the ages of 19 and 23, they acquired Spanish from birth and English during adulthood. They were students of philology at the University of Granada, and they scored 4 out of 5 on the Cambridge Quick Placement Test. Okay, so these are our results, and as you can see in the green, dijo que and confirmo que had faster reading times than dijo that and confirmo that. And it's also important to note that along with measuring the que and that, I also measured the next word, which was the. And the reason for this is so that we can conclude that the reason the sentence is read slower is because the unit was broken rather than a code switch occurred. So again, participants consistently showed processing costs when reading the English complementizer, dijo that versus dijo que, and these costs are independent of verb type. Comprehending code switches does not produce processing costs if switches do not break linguistic units in one of the languages. This has been a great experience for me. I feel like I grew not only academically but also culturally. One of the biggest things for me was I became a better Spanish speaker, and at the beginning it was really hard to interact with participants, but near the end I felt more confident and I was able to interact better. And I just think it's an invaluable asset for me that will help me in whatever career path that I choose to go down. And I'd like to thank Pire, and especially Dr. Ducius, because without you, none of this would have been possible. So thank you so much for all of your help. And everyone else, you guys are great. Thanks. Sure. Oh, any questions? okay?
Yes.
Is costly, does that mean that is it more difficult for them to process and more that showing your reading time?
Yes. Yeah. It's not like if the switch occurs, it's where.
Okay.
So, any other question?
Before we end, I would like to suggest that all of the Pire students come up here so we can take your pictures together. And at the same time, I'd like to thank, on behalf of the Center for Bible Science, I'd like to thank the university's library for allowing us to use this wonderful auditorium today. So thank you.